Transferring the design onto the fabric is always the part of the process that can be a little bit daunting, or maybe a lot daunting. And particularly when you have a design that has so many lines and so much going on. In particular, this one has some different considerations that generally you don't always have. If you're just transferring onto whatever color of fabric and you get to start stitching, that's a little bit different. We have to take into consideration that we are going to be adding color to our white fabric. And since we're using water-based pigment, that brings up some things that we need to consider. I am going to give you 3 options for how to transfer the design onto the fabric. One of them is really simple and the other 2 require a few extra steps. I'm going to go through each one, how to transfer the design, and then I'll have a section where I talk to you specifically about how to add the color, like specifically what color goes where. All right, so let's talk about the first option for transferring the pattern. The first option, and it is absolutely the simplest, the easiest, and that is to buy the pre-printed fabric panel. I am not trying to sell you more stuff or get you to buy stuff that you don't necessarily want, but there's no getting around it. When you buy the pre-printed fabric panel, you don't have to trace or transfer anything. The design is already on the fabric. This ink will not be affected by water, so all you have to do is just take this panel, add the color, do the stuff with the color, and then you're ready to go. That's it. That's all there is to it. So that's why that is the easiest option. Let's talk about option number 2. Option number 2 also does not require you to physically trace the design, to actually transfer the design yourself by hand onto the fabric. It does, however, have a few extra steps in it, and this method is to use your home printer to print the design onto the fabric. There are some considerations for this, like I said, because we'll be using the water-based ink. I did some tests, and my printer, the ink on my printer, when I got it wet, ran all over the fabric. So that meant I could not print it first on the white fabric and then color it. I had to color it and then run it through the printer. Here in just a minute, I will give you a much more lengthy and detailed description of how to print a design onto your fabric, particularly considering the color we need to add. There's also a separate video that's been on my YouTube channel for a while that is about how to transfer a pattern onto fabric using your home printer. Like I said, though, this situation is a little bit different because of the color. So I'm going to tell you about the third option for transferring here right now. But like I said, in a few minutes, I'm going to show you in detail how to do this method. The third option is to trace the design yourself onto your fabric. Again, I'll have a much more detailed explanation here in just a little bit later on. Briefly, this is where you print your pattern out, put it down, lay the hoop on it, trace it, and you're done. Except for, in this instance, again, we have to add the color. So again, watch the more detailed section of this tutorial if that's the method you have chosen. Here are the supplies you will need if you are going to use your home printer to transfer the pattern onto your fabric. So the first thing I have here is cling wrap. That's what this background is all spread out on my table. My table is white, so that's why it looks white. I have 2 layers of cling wrap. Then I have put the printed pattern, which is another thing you will need. It's optional, but it's very helpful. So it's 2 layers of cling wrap, the printed pattern, and then I put another layer of cling wrap on top. You will need your fabric that is ironed. I have cut this to a little bit larger than 8.5 by 11. You don't want it to be smaller than 8.5 by 11. You need it to be a little bit larger. It's about 1/2 inch on each side, but just make sure it's larger. Hey everyone, it is future me here to talk to past me about something about cutting this fabric that is really important. I knew it, but I forgot it, and it led to a mistake that I'm going to show you in just a minute. And don't discount this, because this is really an important step about when you're cutting your fabric to the size you need to put on the label paper when you are going to put it through your home printer. So here's the deal. Fabric has a direction, and in one direction it is way more stretchy than it is in another direction. And let me show you this. So I've got my white fabric here. I'm going to pull it back so I can get to the end of it here. And okay, so fabric has, this is called a selvage, all right? That end that's kind of a fuzzy edge to it. And here's the cut end. Hopefully, I think you can see this, but if I pull it this way, so this is the cut end, so parallel to the cut end, if I pull it, it has a lot of stretch to it. And if I pull it this way, it actually doesn't really stretch at all. And that is important, because when we are putting the fabric later on, after we do all the steps that we'll talk about in a minute, about extending this fabric out so we can put it in after we print it and everything, we are going to be stretching it in the hoop. Because the 8.5 by 11 sticky sheet is narrower this way, you want to make sure that you cut your fabric so that let's see if I can find a sheet of paper. All right, here is my sheet of label paper. When you are deciding which direction to cut your fabric, in other words, when you want to leave a ½ inch extra around your 8.5 by 11 sheet, you're going to decide, does it go this way or this way? You want it to go this way. And by that I mean the long end of the 8.5 by 11 size label paper that you're going to be using. You want that to be parallel to the selvage. You want the cut end down here, because this is the narrow width of the paper, and we're going to, do the print later on. We're going to print the design with, this is the top, bottom, side, and you need the stretchy direction to give you some stretch on that short width. I know that may be a little confusing now. I promise it will make more sense later after you get it all printed and you're stretching it in the hoop. We do the other steps that I'm about to show you about adding extensions on the side. I promise it will make sense. Just trust me. When you are cutting your white fabric to the 8.5 by 11, ½ inch, a little larger than the 8.5 by 11, just make sure that you put the long end along the selvage end and the short end along the cut end of the fabric. I promised I would show you my mistake, so I'm drawing back the curtain here to show you a place where I messed up, because I completely forgot about this whole stretchy needing to be along the short width part of it. And here's what happened. If you look closely right here, all right, I realized this after I'd gotten all the dyeing done. I just did not want to do it all again. My hoop, this specific hoop, is a little bit wider. This is not 8 inches across. It's like 8.5. So an 8.5 by 11, the width of the printer paper is it's a little bit short. And when I stretched it, this is where you're going to see the sewn edge. Again, if that doesn't make sense now, it'll make more sense here in just a little bit after you go through the whole process of what you need to do to print a pattern this size on your home printer. But that's a mistake. I've tried to camouflage it. I know it's there, and now you know it's there. But again, I'll just say, trust me when I say cut your 8.5 by 11 this direction on the fabric. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. And then you'll need your markers and a spray bottle to do this part. The really, really short version of the process I'm going to use here is I am going to take my fabric, dry fabric, lay it on top. I've got, like I said, 2 layers of cling wrap, the printed pattern, and then a layer of cling wrap on top. I know it may look like the paper is on top, but let me see how you can see the reflection there. Trust me, there's a layer of cling wrap over this printed pattern. I'm going to take the dry fabric, lay it on top, take my markers, apply the color where I want it, and then spray it with the spray bottle. Now, like I said, that's the super, super short version. And I did mention that the paper pattern is optional because, you know, I really could just put down some cling wrap, lay out my fabric, and color on it. And then spray it. But I want the color, I want to be, you know, the colors are going to go where they're going to go with this method. You know, you lose some control. It's not like I can be super precise with it, but I do generally want certain colors in certain areas and darker colors in darker areas. Like I don't necessarily, I'm not going to put pink just randomly all over. I want this to look like a sunset. So I'm really going to try to keep the pink in here, towards here, and then a lighter blue. I'm using the same color of blue, but I'm going to put a little less blue right in here, and then I want the edges to be darker. So what having the pattern underneath here does is allow me to see through this fabric when I'm laying down the color so that I can generally know roughly where I want the darker blue, the lighter blue, and the pink. I've centered the fabric on top of the pattern, and you know, on top of the paper that has the pattern printed onto it. I'm going to take two very small pieces of masking tape and just quickly just barely hold that down just so it doesn't completely shift. That's probably not that necessary, but I'm going to do it. And so now I'm going to start applying the color. What we need to do now is to get this ready to go through our printer. You can't just put fabric through the printer. I will mention here that I have a complete, more lengthy video tutorial about how to transfer a pattern onto fabric using your home printer. It's already up. It's been there for a while, and it's a little bit more detailed, so I'm going to move kind of quickly through this part of it. But if you want to go watch that video, I highly recommend that. But let's go ahead with this one. So what I have here is a full sheet piece of sticky label paper. This is the kind that is going to peel off like this, okay? So here's the front side. I'm going to flip this over and I am going to peel this and put the sticky side down on the back of this paper. That's why I cut the fabric a little bit larger than the sticky label paper, because I don't want to have to be lining up the edges. I can just put this roughly on the fabric like that. Here is a little pro tip before I peel this off and stick it on the back here. On one corner, I have just cut off a tiny little corner. The reason I did that is because later on, after I stick this onto the back of my fabric and run it through my printer, I will then be peeling off this label paper. And it's going to be a lot easier if I have just a teeny tiny corner where it's not solid label paper to peel this off. You don't have to do that. If you forget that step, not a big deal. It can easily be done, but that's going to help you just a little bit right there. My label sticky paper is stuck to the back of the fabric. Now what I need to do before I run it through my printer is to trim each edge so that it's right along the edge of the sticky paper. I've trimmed it. Now it's really important to make sure that you don't have any little ragged edges, any little fraying edges or little pieces of fabric on the edges, because you don't want to run that through your printer, because you don't want those little frayed edges to clog up your printer. So now pay attention to however you load your printer to make sure the correct side is up or down, or the top goes in first or last, or however your printer works. Just make sure you do a test print if you need to, but now just make sure you put it in your printer the correct way and print this just like you would any other piece of paper. Now what we need to do is to peel off the sticky backing. And this is the part where I mentioned this little trick right here about this cutting off that little corner. Because you see, if I could absolutely do this. It would take me just a minute and I could I could stick a needle down in there and I could get that peeled back, but it's just a little bit frustrating. If you have trimmed off a corner, can you see that? This little corner right here, it's really easy to just grab the fabric, grab the label, and pull. Now when you do this, I like to hold the fabric down with one hand and very slowly pull. This cotton fabric is going to hold up really well, but I don't want to just rip it off because it can kind of, you know, warp the fabric a little bit, stretch it out, which not that big of a deal, but I don't want to just rip it off like a Band-Aid. So I'm going to carefully hold it down like this and pull. The edges, you are going to pull some, you know, it's going to fray, but that's fine. But just pull it off. Hold the fabric down and pull it off like this. So now we have our fabric, dyed, beautifully printed. Let's pop it in the hoop and get stitching, right? Not so fast, because if you'll note, we are going to be stitching in an 8-inch hoop. And if you put a hoop on this and try to stretch this fabric in this hoop, you've got plenty of fabric on this end and this end, but over here, we were limited to an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And this hoop is 8, actually a little bit more than 8 inches across. So how are we going to make that work? Well, previously up to this, I always said that if you're going to print on your home printer, you are limited to hoops that are like 6 inches or smaller, because you can put a 6-inch hoop across here and have enough fabric on the edges to pull your fabric when you're stretching it in the hoop. But there is an option that we have to use an 8-inch hoop and the home printer. We just have to do another extra step. And here is that extra step. I am going to take 2 strips of fabric. Doesn't really matter what color, because it's going to be hidden behind the hoop, but I still have some more of this white fabric. And I'm going to take these 2 strips of fabric and I'm going to sew the edges right along the edge on each side. I have a sewing machine, and so I am going to use a sewing machine. And you know, you don't have a whole lot of room to work with over here because we were limited to 8.5 wide and the hoop itself is 8.5. But if I just have about a 1/4 of an inch overlap right here, I don't need to seam it like a seam. You know, a seam is where you put the right sides together, sew the edges, and then flip it like that. I could do that, but I don't really need to. You can just put them flat against each other like this and just sew a very strong line of sewing on each side to extend this fabric, the width of this fabric. If you don't have a sewing machine, you could also hand sew it. I would just make sure that it's a very strong stitch. I wouldn't do a whip stitch that goes, you know, around, has horizontal stitches, because you're going to be pulling it really hard this way and those might stretch a little bit. I think if you do a stitch like a split back stitch or a split stitch, which they're pretty much the same as far as, you know, the result, just something that is a nice tight stitch all the way along here and attach both of these strips to each side, and now you've got wider fabric. And there we are. There are the strips sewn to the side. So now I can stretch this fabric in the hoop like this, just like I would do any other fabric. I'm not going to take the time to do this perfectly at the moment, but now I can put this on here and loosen that a little bit more. There we go. So now when it comes time to stretch this hoop, stretch the fabric, now you see I can pull it. I'm going to stretch, stretch, stretch. And I'm going to keep stretching till it's really, really tight. I like my fabric incredibly tight. And so if I keep pulling, see the seams are just underneath the hoop right here. I mean, they're just right there. So it's a tight fit, but when I stretch the fabric, it will land inside between the hoops. So you won't even see those seams. So now what I not everybody does this, but I like to trim around this fabric with my trusty, so ugly, but I love them dearly, scalloped scissors. They're pinking shears, you know, normally they're zigzag, but these are scallop. Love them with all my heart. And now I will, once I get it stretched the way I want it, I will trim around it. The pinking shears keep it from constantly unraveling like this, which those little threads can get caught in your stitches. But I will trim this around so it stays out of my way, and then I'll be ready to stitch. The method I'm going to talk about here is the tracing method of transferring your pattern. Now I'm going to say right away, so that you don't miss this part, please, if you are familiar with this method and think, oh, I can just skip through this part, I know what I'm doing, I'm just going to skip on and move on. Please do not do that. Please listen to what I have to say, because there is one very key thing that you're going to need to know about the tools used for this method that might be different from your usual tools. So let me talk about the supplies you will need. You will need the pattern printed onto just regular copy paper. I've cut it out on the dotted line that will fit down in this hoop. You'll need your fabric, your white fabric, and your 8-inch hoop. And then you will need something to trace a design onto the fabric with. And you will need some tape, masking tape, scotch tape, whatever. This is the key part right here, okay? Let me briefly, very quickly, I have a whole separate video, as always, on the basic tracing method using a light source. That's what I mean when I say the tracing method, if you want to watch that. But here's the quick version. I've already stretched the fabric in my hoop. I'm going to flip it over. Oh, no, sorry. I'm going to put the pattern down. If you want to, you can tape this in place. I highly recommend that. And then I'm going to lay my hoop on top of the design. All right. I have a white background, so it's very easy to see through on this white fabric. If you can't see, if you don't have a white background that you can use easily, you can put it on a light box, which is a wonderful tool to have. If you don't have a light box, you can put it, tape this to a sunny window, and then put this up. You can even tape this fabric to the glass, to the window, so that it doesn't shift around, because you do not want it to shift while you are tracing. And you can use a light source like that. I also have been known to tape this on and hold it up like this, and then I have a lamp that I swing across, and it's like a swing arm lamp, and I can turn it up, or you can hold this over a lamp, and when the light shines through, you can see it. That's the basic method. And then you use a pen to trace a design on. The very important part of this that you really need to hear is the pen that you are going to use to trace it onto the fabric. You must use a pen that is not water soluble, because after we trace this, we're going to color over it with the colored markers, and then we're going to spray it with water. If you use something like a friction pen or friction pen, however you say it, I often use this pen. It's one of my favorite ones to use for tracing. If this is the one you use all the time, you're going to be unhappy, because when you spray it, it's going to move, bleed, disappear. All your hard work of tracing the pattern is going to be gone. If you have some sort of pen that you are not familiar with, if you don't know what it is, you can always read the label sometimes, or Google it to see if it's water-based. I highly recommend, if you just don't know, to get a little scrap piece of fabric, scribble on it with your pen, put it on a glass bowl or some water surface that can be sprayed on, spray it with water, see if that ink moves through the fabric. These are alcohol-based. This is the Sharpie Extra Fine. This is called a Sharpie, I really just think it's called Fine, which is kind of confusing, but anyway. I know they are alcohol-based, and I know that they do not bleed when I spray them with water. Using the right kind of pen to trace the design on is absolutely the most critical part of this, okay? Just make sure that you are using something that won't bleed, all right? So I know that these two won't bleed. Just another quick note, you do not have to have this stretched in the fabric stretched in your hoop first, but I find it very helpful. You can just lay your piece of fabric on top of this design with the fabric flat and trace it. I find it a little trickier to trace like that because the fabric kind of wants to move on you a little bit and bunch up, like as you're dragging your pen across, it can kind of catch the fabric. When the fabric is stretched tight like this, you know how you're gonna stretch it as tight as you would have it stretched when you're ready to stitch, it's so much easier because the fabric does not move. You already know the size of the pattern. In other words, it fits inside the hoop even after you've stretched it. I just find it easier. Like I said, you can trace it with the pattern behind it like this, or you can do this and go like that, trace it. Regardless, I find it easier with the fabric stretched in the hoop. Once you have finished tracing your design, whether it's on this side or this side, I did not do that. I'm not going to do that because I'm not going to use this method for my sample, but let's just pretend this is traced on here on either side. You will now need to, if you had it in the hoop, you'll need to take it out of the hoop. If you did not put it in the hoop to begin with, you're already ready to go. And so now let's say you've got your design traced onto your fabric. The next step is going to be to get that color on it, on top of the tracing that you did. And that's why you needed to use a non-water soluble tracing pen. I am not going to show you on this one, obviously, because it's not trace, but I will show you how to do that when I am doing the one that shows the pre-printed fabrics. Regardless of which method of pattern transfer you use, you are going to apply color to your fabric. What I am showing here is I'm doing it on the pre-printed fabric. So if you are doing it for the home printer version, it will look different than this. It won't already have this on it, and there's a little bit different setup. And if you are doing the one where you traced it, it will look very similar to this because but it'll be traced, okay? So it just doesn't look quite the same. The setup here is a little bit different. That depends on the method you're using. My setup here is, and you may hear this information, I might be doubling up on this information or repeating myself if you've watched or if you're doing the home printer version, but anyway, let me just say it here again. To apply the color to the fabric, what you're going to need is a very level surface. Later on, after we put the color on and we put water on it, it's going to move. And if you're on a surface that's a little bit tilted, you know, forward, backwards, or whatever, uneven, the water is going to move in that direction. And you really kind of want it to spread evenly across all of the fabric. You don't want it to go all in one direction, okay? So make sure your surface is level. This is my work table, which is white. That's why it looks white under here, but I have covered it with 2 or 3 layers of cling wrap. Now you don't really have to do 3 layers. I can just keep putting layers on top. But just make sure it's a surface that it doesn't matter if it gets wet, because if you get a little overspray, you know, like don't do this on your nice dining table or whatever. Regardless, put down some cling wrap on a flat surface so that when you do spray water, your surface is protected, okay? The other thing you want to make sure of is that your fabric has been ironed. You don't want any wrinkles or even like a little slight wrinkle. This is dry fabric, okay? So make sure you start out with it dry. You don't want any kind of wrinkles because that could show up when you're coloring. And if it's a strong wrinkle, it'll cause the ink to move differently. And you don't want like a harsh line, okay? Across, you want this to be kind of a smooth blending of colors. Now let's talk about how we're going to get the color onto the fabric. And to do that, we are using these water-based markers, okay? So the pigment in here is water-based. That's why it will move when we add water to it. All right, we're using only 2 colors. We are using a blue and a pink, kind of a very pretty magenta pink. Now these react a little bit differently to water, even though they're both water-based. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pink here in a minute, but we're going to start with the blue. When I'm thinking about how I want the color to be on this, over this design, you know, I'm going to lose a lot of control about where colors go when I spray this with water, because it just has a mind of its own, all right? So give up a little bit of control here, and that's hard for me. I like my color to be where I want it to be, right? But I have to give up a little bit of control. But I do have a plan, and a plan will affect, you know, how you apply the color will affect what it looks like in some degree, okay? I know that I want it to be darker around these edges, blue, all this blue, and I want it to be still dark but a little bit lighter in here, and I want a little bit of a sunset effect, okay? So I'm going to add the pink right in here in this sort of section. Remember, there's going to be butterfly wings covering here, so like a little bit of this right here is covered up, and the castle's not going to show anything behind it. But anyway, that's my plan. So I'm going to make sure, and I also want to make sure that I color far enough beyond this. If I just color like right up to here, I want to, you know, the blue is going to move out, but I want to make sure it moves out enough because the hoop is going to end up being right about here. So keep that in mind. So color beyond the edges of your lines. So I'm going to stop chatting and start coloring. There are two tips on this pen. There's a brush tip and a fine tip. We're not going to use the fine tip. We're going to use the brush tip, right? And I'm just going to start coloring. My method for this is to just start coloring, okay? And I kind of have the pen turned on the side. I'm not mushing, I'm not putting it, you know, at a, you know, vertically like this. First of all, that kind of mushes the tip, but I also want to get a lot of that ink on there. And I'm just going in little squiggles. I generally try to move in little horizontal lines. Again, like I said, when I add the water, this color is going to swirl around, but I don't want, you know, like, I didn't really want vertical. I don't really know if it matters, but this is just the way I do it. So I'm going to add, I'm leaving little patches of white because I want a little variation. I don't necessarily want all one solid, exact, you know, every color, every bit of blue is the exact same strength. So I'm going to let it have a little bit of variation in it. I think I forgot to mention that I have taped down this fabric with 2 pieces of masking tape. That's not critical. I just did it so it wouldn't shift around a whole lot while I'm videoing. I'm going well beyond the edges of the, sorry, my hand's in the way, but I kind of sort of have to hold it down. Now this does use up a good bit of blue ink, and I've done this several times, and I've already gone through one whole blue pen. So if you're using a pen that's older, or if you use it for a bunch of other stuff and it doesn't have enough ink in it, make sure you start with one that's fairly new. I think I have, with this pen, I've already done at least one other piece of fabric, but it does make a difference because that means there's less ink coming out of it. So I'm going to keep doing just this. You don't need to watch me do this entire thing like this, all right? I'm going to finish up this ring like just the way I'm doing it here. And that's where I am now. Everything's pretty even, but with those little speckles of white. I'm going to give my blue marker a rest because it's tired at the moment. And I might have used more of this ink already than I thought because it felt like it was getting a little bit dry. So sometimes those brush tips, if you use them a lot or if they get wet, the ink kind of gets wicked out of the tip. So I'm going to let this rest for a minute. Maybe some more ink will sort of bleed down into that tip. So now I'm going to work with this pink color. And for some reason, this pink does not like to move through the fabric as easily as the blue does. The blue just goes. The pink is a little more stubborn on fabric. So I'm going to be very careful about how I apply this pink and how much I add. I am, again, using the brush tip. I'm not going to color as hard as I did with the blue because that's just going to put too much pink down and it's going to be in a blob, and that blob is going to sort of stay there. I want, this pink is strong too, so I mean it will really be pink even if I put a little bit down. So I'm going to very carefully put some very judicious amounts of pink on here. I know this is where I want my sunset. I am going to hold it so that it is, the brush tip is like parallel to the fabric. I'm not going to hold it up like this and color up really hard. I am going to lightly skim the fabric really gently, mostly right in here, and I'm going to add a few little wisps up in here. Where I go over the blue, it's going to turn to purple, which is fine. That's what I want. The only place I want like any kind of pure pink, which it may not even end up being pink, it may go to purple when the water, you know, moves through it, is just a little bit in here if I can make it look like the sunset. But again, it might go completely purple and that'll be fine. Regardless, so I'm just holding it like this and I'm just very lightly. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm trying not to get any hard shapes, like, you know, strong lines. Like if I put this brush tip down and hold it for a minute and then drag it, I'm going to get a line where that, so I'm trying to move as I put some pink down so it's just really, because I got a little bit of a line right there and I'm trying to avoid that. So I do want some purple. I'm going to come across here. I want maybe the teeniest bit of pink across in here. I'm going to add more blue here in a minute so it'll sort of mix with that pink that I'm putting down. All right, I don't want a whole lot of purple over in here, but I just maybe a teeny bit. You can already see that it looks purple when you color over the blue. So I am just not putting much at all, because if I put too much, it's just going to overtake it. It might be the strongest part right there. I have no control over where these purple places are going to go. So I just want it to be very light. All right. All right, I'm gonna stop there. Evidently not. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Maybe. I keep breaking my rule about not putting too much there. Like I said, a lot of right in here is gonna be covered by butterfly wings, so maybe I'll bring in one more, a little higher. All right, I'm stopping there. All right, don't do too much. If anything, do a little less pink. My blue pen has rested, and hopefully it has revived itself a little bit. Before I go in and color the center section, because I am going to add blue right there, I am going to come back and add some really intense little blobs of color, because if I just left it all looking like this, and I mean, obviously, even if I colored the center in the same way and it was all sort of the sameness, the same level of darkness or lightness, it'll be pretty, but it won't have a whole lot of variation. And I do want some really dark areas of blue. So to do that, I am really going to color in, again, keeping with the very jagged, you know, not trying to cover all those white spots. I'm really gonna let the ink soak into just like that, not in the center. I'm going to do darker, a few more darker splotches down here where it's underneath all these flowers, and some on the sides. But just because the more ink that is sitting in the fabric, when you spray it, will remain darker. And when there's less ink on the fabric, when you spray it, that'll be a little bit lighter. So I want these light and dark areas to swirl together. So I think you can see what I'm doing. I'm just really, some of them, even if after they dry, I might come back and add some more, but hopefully I have enough ink to make enough of these dark spots. There are the darker spots, and now what I need to do is go back in and add the blue for the rest of the sky. I don't want any dark blobs, but I do want blue color. I don't want it to be white in there. So I'm just going to color right over the clouds. Kind of like I did for at the beginning, the main circle that I did. Okay, I'm going to Be the most careful in here. Again, I'm thinking about the butterfly wings are going to cover about right here. So I'm going to bring some blue in. Don't want to cover up all that pink down there by the sunset. Sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't finish my thought. I was thinking about what I was coloring. Don't forget between these two towers right here and right over in here. So a little bit lighter in the center there. Okay, I think I have everything covered. All right, I could play with it for another 20 minutes, but you know, sometimes you just have to stop. All right, I think that's done now. Time for the magic and adding the water. This is just I just got this spray bottle at like a beauty supply. You do not want, you know, if it has one of those tips that you can get like a thin stream or a spray, you want the spray. You do not want a hard, thin stream, you know, jet of water. You want a nice droplet spray. Okay, so if you need to turn that, test it first, all right? Because you don't want to like spray on here and be like, oh, that was wrong. You also want to try to sort of spray down. You don't want to spray at an angle, you know, like at a hard direction, because any force direction that you send this water, again, this stuff is just gonna, it just tends to swirl in its own direction, even on a level surface, but don't like make a hard spray like starting here and going out. The other consideration with the water is how much. If you leave dry spots, then the ink will move a little, but it tends to sort of stop in those spots, and you don't want that. You want all of this color to blend together. You also don't want to keep spraying and keep spraying and keep spraying so that you have just added so much water that it's just saturated, because that will blend the colors so much that you won't get a lot of variation. It won't necessarily be wrong or ugly. It can just move the ink away from the center, and you don't need color out here, which is going to be hidden, you know, and you're not going to see that. You don't want like light in the middle and dark on the edges. You want the ink to, as much as possible, to stay in here. So don't just keep spraying so much that the colors just, it's just so much water, all right? It's kind of the art of it. It's a little bit nerve-wracking to figure out, did I spray enough? But just spray it, look closely at it, make sure there's no dry, like speckledy spots, okay? All right, so I'm just gonna go, all right? I'm gonna spray, and then I'll probably just let this run, let the video run, and I'll do a time lapse of it, because it's really cool to see it when it's sped up. So I'm just gonna go ahead here. I'm gonna spray fast and, you know, quickly enough that I'm not like one side is getting really, really wet and this side's dry, because I just kind of want to go evenly. All right, so here I go. Do want to make sure that the edges get, okay, so that, I don't think there's any water right there. I don't know if you can see it. That's kind of speckledy, so I'm going to add a little water there. I think it's dry right there. So at this point, I've got a lot of water on there, and I don't want to just keep adding really, really intense sprays of water, because then, like I said, it'd be adding so much that it would just wash everything away. I think I'm going to leave it there. I'm pretty sure I have enough water on it for it to move through the fabric enough. So now I'm just going to let this run, and it'll be really interesting to see how it turns out. I have no idea. It looks a little different every time, but I'm just going to let it run. This is still drying, but seeing that time lapse I know is really cool. It's fun to watch it sped up like that. But here it is. It is still wet. I'm going to let it dry. You can either just let it sit right where it is. It may take overnight or all day, depending on the weather and how humid it is outside, but you do not want to pick it up and move it somewhere else. I have also taken the hairdryer to it, and if you're going to do that, make sure you've taped it down ahead of time, because otherwise if you put the hairdryer on it and the hairdryer catches it underneath, and it'll send it flying, and you do not want that, okay? Because you will get blue color on whatever it touches at this point while it's wet. So be very careful if you do the hairdryer, but it is an option if you want to speed up the process. Otherwise, if you're using the pre-printed fabric, once it's dry, this one is ready to put in the hoop and stitch. If you're doing the home printer method, like I mentioned, it's going to be a little bit different, so make sure you watch that video for that. Another unique aspect of this design is that we are going to be dyeing our own threads. And just like when we talked about the fabric, there is one thing that is really, really, really important that you have to know and be aware of and take care about. And that is that, just like the fabric, these threads are not color fast. So if water touches them again, they are going to bleed. If you have a wet hand and you pick them up, it's going to come off on your hand. If you have a piece of fabric laying around, whatever, these cannot get wet once they are dyed. And before we go any further, let me just say that you do not have to dye all of the threads for this project. You could absolutely just use regular solid color threads and it would be very pretty. The only thing to realize is that these pink threads, there's not really a commercially available thread that you can buy that I have found that's just a 6-stranded embroidery thread that is this really intense pink. I wish there was. Trust me, I have looked for it. So that may be the only thing that you would find. You know, the pinks that are available are very nice, but they're just not quite as bright and almost fluorescent as the pinks on that we're going to dye. So, you know, I just say that because you may not want to spend the time doing this, even though it's a lot of fun. It's so much fun to see the colors blend together, just like anything. So if you have the time, it's definitely a fun experiment and a fun way to stretch the threads that you have. So instead of having to buy 3 shades of pink and 3 shades of yellow and 2 shades of green and 3 purples and 2, you know, a mustard yellow and a brown, you know, you can buy fewer skeins of thread, and these 2 markers, we're just going to use the same colors and extend the color ranges that you have to stitch with. Supplies and setup for this technique. You need, get those out of the way. Okay, you're going to need one surface, and it's not this one, but you're going to need one surface somewhere else that is covered in 2 or 3 layers of cling wrap. Pretty large surface. I recommend about at least a little over 36 inches wide, and 36 inches long, and however wide you want it. I mean, the wider it is, the more threads you're going to be able to dry all at once. So that's one surface. I use a plastic plate like this, and I have also covered it in a layer of cling wrap. You know, you don't have to do that, but I figure, I mean, I reuse this over and over and over and over, so I'm not constantly replacing this cling wrap, but this is really handy just the way I have it set up here. I have cut my threads. We're going to be dyeing different colors of threads. A lot of them are just start out with white. That's why you extend your colors, because you get a bunch of colors out of white thread, and then some solid colors, but these are cut into 1-yard lengths. This thread is going to shrink just a little bit because you're getting it soaking wet, so it shrinks up, you know, 1 inch or 2 maybe. So if you want to cut it a little longer than 1 yard so that when it's dry you have exactly 1 yard, but whatever, your thread cut into roughly 1-yard lengths. You need your spray bottle with water, and this is something I highly recommend, is plastic gloves. This, even though this is water-based, and if you get it on your fingers, it will stain temporarily. Even if you go wash your hands immediately, it doesn't come out immediately, but after, you know, a couple of washings, you know, you don't walk around with permanently dyed hands. But I just like to stay everything neat so I'm not transferring color, and plus you're not looking at my fingers all black with color, all, you know, all these different weird colors. So anyway, plastic gloves very handy. So let me show you the technique that I've found that is kind of the most straightforward. Some of the colors, some of the threads have just one color on them. A lot of them have both pink and blue on them, but let me show you one of the solid color pink ones. And for the pink, I did a very light pink, some that had slightly darker pink, so I classified it as a medium pink, and then I had some that were like really intensely pink. So let's say we're going to do the medium one. So the technique is pretty similar regardless. The really light colored threads, there's a little bit different technique. I'll show you that in just a minute, but let's just talk about kind of the general how to get the color onto the thread. The basic technique that I use to get the color onto the thread, and I've zoomed in so you can see a little bit better, is to lay the thread out. Now this is my cling wrap covered work table, so I am going to use a technique where I hold the tip of the marker onto the thread in one place and I pull the thread. Now I'm not trying to color across the thread like this, because if I do that, I'm just going to leave a ton of color on the cling wrap, and I don't want it on the cling wrap, I want it on my thread. So I really try to think about holding the tip still and pulling the thread through. Of course, if you're left-handed, you can do it like this and pull it this direction. And depending on what strength of color you want, you're going to want to leave stretches of the base color thread uncolored. It does not take a lot of color, trust me. You can skim the thread very lightly with this marker and get a ton of color. But if you want to we were doing kind of the medium one, I said, so I'm going to leave a little area of white, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to just pull and do that, pull again. If I push down really hard, I'm going to leave more color. So let's say I want a really dark section right here. So I've already done that. I'm going to hold the tip again, and I'm going to pull it slowly, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add a really intense area of pink right there, and then just gradually. So you do still end up with some on your cling wrap, that's fine. But I don't want this one to be solid dark pink, so I'm going to move up again, have kind of a light area, do a really intense area again. And I found that when I was first trying this, I colored the whole thread. I really didn't leave much white thread showing, and it ended up where it just ended up all one color. It was all just one strength of color. And I really wanted slightly lighter, slightly darker areas. So I learned to leave some areas. Sometimes all you need is a little dash of color, but I learned to leave some areas of white thread showing. And later on when I spray it, I'll make sure there's not like harsh white blocks of white right there. So I'm just going to do this whole thread. Some lighter areas right there, but I did want this to be more medium, so I'm going to go add more right there. It's very random. So this is the end. I'm going to add pretty dark on that end. It is hard to remember to leave the tip still and to pull the thread. So, all right, so that's a pretty, I don't know if you can see that. All right. So that is got areas of white and lots of ink in some areas and lighter inks in other, or lighter amount of ink in other areas. I already have my plastic gloves on, because the next step I am going to do is I am going to just randomly lay this thread in this plate. All right, I don't really care how it goes in there, I'm just getting it in there. Sometimes I leave a little end right here so I can pick it up easily, but that's not a big deal. All right, so now I'm going to take my spray bottle and I'm going to spray on top of all this. Just like the fabric, if I spray and keep spraying and put a ton of water on this, it's going to be the soup, and this thread is just going to be swimming in this pink soup, and it's going to make the whole thing kind of a little too all the same color. Like I said, I like slightly darker areas, slightly lighter areas. I don't want it to, I'm not trying to make just a solid pink thread. So I'm going to just add a little water. You can kind of hit the areas that have color on them, but almost immediately you'll start to see how it's starting to run. And now you've got water down in this plate too, little beads of water, and you can kind of swirl it. If you can, as you swirl it, you'll start to see, so there's like that color coming out right there. If you see areas that just didn't get any water on them, like they're sitting up or something, like right here, I don't want a solid white span of color. I want it to be blend more seamlessly. So I can keep swirling it. I can also just take my thumb and just kind of mush it right there and see how it turned. You see that? See how it, now it's pink, it's not white. I don't want stripes. I don't want white stripes on this. Doesn't take a lot. That was kind of a dry area. So now I like this because this is a really dark area and this is a really light area, and this has just a little bit of white on it. So I like that. Something to know about this pink marker is when you spray it, it's going to look really orange, really fluorescent-y orange. It's really odd. Once it dries to that really pretty, intense, bright pink color. But at first I was like, oh, I don't like that color. It's orange. No, when it gets wet, it's orangey. When it's dry, it's pinker. And the lighter areas are pinker here, you can see. So I'm going to make sure, now I'm going to go over to my big area that's covered with cling wrap, and I'm going to pick up this end, and I'm going to pick up this end. And I'm going to stretch this out. I'm not going to show this to you because it's huge. But anyway, I'm just going to stretch this thread out straight, or as straight as it can be, and so that it's not touching any other thread that happens to be over there. And then I'll just let it dry. I'm back here with my plate that I just used, and generally I will take a paper towel and wipe this out, unless there's a technique I'm going to show you in just a second that I'm going to use that water. But for the next thread, I just kind of like to start over with a clean, dry, because if I never wiped that out, there's just more water being added, more water on top of more water, more color, and then again, you just have that kind of like all one color soup. Now let me show you a really, really light colored thread, and I'm going to use this this isn't a bright yellow, it's a very kind of a mustardy yellow, and this is one of those threads, this is for the castle. And if you didn't want to do this for the castle, if you just wanted to use this thread just the way it is, that'd be fine. But I wanted just a teeny tiny bit of variation. I don't really want to stitch the castle with orange thread, but I do want just a little bit of variation. So I am going to add just the barest, I mean like hardly skim this thread with this pink marker. And so to do that, I'm going to do a slightly different technique. Instead of holding it down and running it through, I'm really just going to, and this works for white thread. If you want to add a teeny tiny bit of color, you can mix the colors, do the pink and blue together and get a really, really, really light lavender on white thread. But regardless of the color, here's how I get a super, super light coloring. I really hold it with one hand right here, and then I kind of hold it with these fingers and it's open. And then I'm really going to just barely touch this tip and just pull it through as I just skim the thread. So let me show you that. I am touching it and lifting up. I'm going to move a ways, barely touching it, kind of on the top and the bottom, like hardly even barely touching it at all. Like I said, I mean, I could make a super bright orange thread with this by really adding a lot of pink to this yellow color, but I really want to just have barely any color. But it looks like there's not even any on there. But let me add it to my plate just like I did before. Make sure I can find the ends. And I'll do the same thing. Now I'm going to spray it. And it might not look like much, but there is color on there. And it will really show up when it's stitched too. So it's just turning a little bit darker. Not sure if you can see that. But anyway, that's how to get a really light skimming of color onto a thread. A technique that works great if you want really, really light colored threads is to use the water from a previous thread. So here I was dyeing, I think one of the blue threads, and I was adding both pink and blue color onto that thread. And when I sprayed it and picked up the thread, this is what I had left. So I have this colored water. It's still very wet. So if I'm gonna now take my white thread that has no color on it. I have not added any marker or any color to the thread itself, but now I can lay it into this these leftover swirls of pink and purple and blue, and just make sure that as much of the thread that I want is getting, sometimes I will tilt it a little bit and see if I can get the water to move. Like right here I have a section that's just really white and I want just a little bit of color, so I'm really just going to press it down into that blue. But now it's picked up plenty of color, and so now I will go lay it out on my big surface. Now let's make a thread that is a combination of the two colors, the pink and the blue, and this gives you some really gorgeous colors. Let me put this behind white paper so you can see this one in particular. So see that? Can you see how it has some light pink in it? It has dark purple. Some of it even has like a navy color in it. Just a really gorgeous variety of colors, and this is all on white thread. You can also do this kind of thing on colored thread, like this solid color blue thread, and that gives you some really different purples, because if you add pink onto this blue, that gives you a purple, and then if you add the blue onto this blue, that gives you like a deeper turquoise. So that's really fun. But let's do this one on white thread. The technique for making a thread that has two colors on it is just the same, but this one, let me show you. I'm going to make some really dark areas of pink. If you add this very, very light pink and then very, very light blue, you get a beautiful light lavender. And if you add darker, it gets a really nice dark purple. Right, so now I'm going to add some blue. I want this whole thread to be a little darker, so I am going to add more color of each one. Sometimes I'm going to blend them on the thread. I'm going to cover over the pink with the blue. You can already see it's turning a little bit purple. Some areas I'm going to have just the strong blue. I want really strong blue right here maybe. And the beauty of this is that every single one comes out different, even if you follow the exact same recipe. But they can look a little bit similar, depending on how much ink and how much water. Once you've done several of them, you kind of find yourself, you get a rhythm. Add really dark blue. Don't want a whole lot of white showing on this one, so I'm going to add tons of blue right in here. Really dark, so I'm going to go over that section a couple of times. Make a really dark section up here. Mix that with the pink right there. So it's very random, but that is what is so fun about it, is you just never know what you're going to get. And it's always different, but it is always gorgeous. Okay, so time to go get this one wet. Time to spray this one, and you should see a whole bunch of color come out. The longer it sits, the more it will mix together. really swirl this one around. Okay, see that? I love that beautiful dark blue it gets in there, and that really pretty lavendery blue. Okay, so I'm gonna go lay this one out to dry. I didn't want all the color left on that plate to go to waste, so I just got a length of the bright blue, this color thread right here, and put it down in the plate with the color that's already there, and I'm just swirling it around and kind of pushing it in places so it gets evenly blended. So I just don't want to let any color go to waste. And this is going to be just as pretty and a little bit different than the previous one I did, because the other one was on white, and this one's going to have a lot more lavender in it. So anyway, don't let any of that color go to waste.